This episode is brought to you by Confluence. Confluence is a professional consulting firm comprised of landscape architects, urban designers, and planners. Our staff of 70 plus includes 39 licensed landscape architects and AICP certified planners, and our firm is comprised of energetic, creative, and passionate people who are involved in making our communities better places to live. We assist our clients on a wide range of public, educational, institutional, and private sector projects. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Our guest today is the owner of Sundaisy Enterprises, Christy Eichhorn. Christy is an AICP certified community and regional planner with over 20 years of experience in public sector program planning and management. Christy has become a bridge between urban planning and the telecommunications industry in the last 5 years, primarily working in the Great Plains. Christy followed her passion and started Sundaisy Enterprises in 2020 to help communities with planning and zoning needs specializing in telecommunications and renewable energy infrastructure. Christy is here to talk to us about the book, The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. In the book, cultural anthropologist Gretchen Bakke unveils the many facets of America's energy infrastructure, its most dynamic moments and its most stable ones, and its essential role in personal and national life. The grid, she argues, is an essentially American artifact, one which developed with us, a product of bold expansion, the occasional foolhardy vision, some genius technologies, and constant improvisation. Most of all, her focus is on how Americans are changing the grid right now. Before we jump into the interview, it's important to understand what our grid is and how it functions. So many of us just turn our light switch on without thinking about what it took for that to happen. The American electric grid is not actually one single grid, but three synchronous grids. There's the Eastern Interconnection, Western Interconnection, and Texas Interconnection. These grids are tied together at various points to allow power to be transmitted through the U.S. While the Eastern and Western grids has 7 ties to each other, the Texas grid has but 2 connections to the Eastern system. The grids are operated by transmission system operators, nonprofits typically owned by utilities in their service areas. They can operate within one single state or cover wider areas crossing state lines. Electricity generation starts at a power source such as a power station or solar farm. From there, electric power transmission lines move energy from the site to an electric substation, which is then connected to the distribution system. This network is different from the local wiring that runs from high-voltage substations to customers. The last piece to know about the electric grid is how it's stored. Electrical energy is stored during times when electricity is plentiful and inexpensive or when demand is low, like during the day, and later return to the grid when demand is high in the evening and prices go up. As of 2020, the largest form of grid energy storage was dammed hydroelectricity, with both conventional hydroelectric generation as well as pumped storage hydroelectricity. Developments in battery storage are enabling better storage during peak production. However, there is a long way to go in order to support all the new renewable energy sources going online each day. Now that you're up to speed on the electric grid, let's dive into our interview with Christy. Well, welcome to the podcast today, Christy, and thanks for joining us. Can you start off with a quick overview of your background and what led you to start your own energy-focused company, Sundaisy Enterprises?
Hi, Stephanie. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me on the podcast to talk about the grid. It was one of my favorite books last year, and I'm hopeful that other planners will find it as useful and interesting as I did. Although I currently do a lot of work in both telecommunications and zoning code rewrites, my passion is finding solutions that will get us to a net zero carbon economy. I've always had an interest in infrastructure, from my days working in wastewater and recycling to my current work in telecommunications. I like to know why things are the way they are. Maybe that's why I liked this book so much. It provides a lot of interesting backstory on our electric grid without sounding like a textbook or reading like a white paper. I came across this book in 2020 Well, hang on. Wait, let me take a step back. In 2019, I was ready for a change. And where I really wanted to be was in the renewable energy space. The problem was that I didn't have a solid background in clean energy, the impacts of carbon, or climate change. What I did know was that the first step was to do some self-education. I wanted to understand what a zero carbon energy future really looks like. So I enrolled in the Financing and Deploying Clean Energy Certificate program at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. It was a fantastic program. I learned so much in that year. And it was during that program that one of my fellow students introduced me to the book, The Grid. It came highly recommended. If anybody is looking to learn more about carbon, about clean energy, for pragmatic ways to have an impact on carbon emissions, you should really take a look at the program. Anyway, during my time participating, I realized how unique that Nebraska is as a state with no renewable portfolio standards, and it is the only 100% public power state in the nation. It made me wonder if and how we should be planning differently for the energy transition in Nebraska's rural areas that are really focused on agriculture, forestry, and ranching. What tools do we have in our toolbox now, and what tools are we missing? So I started Sundaisy Enterprises in 2020 because I believe that I can help our rural communities and small businesses find and use the necessary tools, which I believe are embedded in good planning principles, to transition to an alternative energy future.
That's a really good point. So many of our planning programs don't get into energy, or if they do, it's just a small portion of the program compared to what we spend time learning about, whether it be qualitative and quantitative analysis, taking GIS classes, or learning about planning theory, among many other topics. It really is up to us to get educated on the topic outside of our degrees, like what you chose to do with your certificate program, which is really interesting. And I didn't know those kind of opportunities were out there, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Now, you mentioned that you have a focus on rural areas in your work. What would you say the relationship is, or what is unique about the grid's relationship in rural areas?
What I learned from Gretchen's book is that rural areas are going to be key to improving the resiliency of the grid. There's not only lots of opportunity in generating electricity from renewables, but the room to strengthen the grid through new and upgraded transmission lines. Although the opportunity is there and the funding is there, unless we start having conversations now, start the feedback process now, the needed improvements are not likely to gain support and will slow down or even kill the transition to a more reliable energy system.
In the book, the author Gretchen Bakke talks about how as consumers we're at odds with how the grid was built over the last century. What does she mean by that?
Yes, I would say the most striking thing that I learned from Gretchen's book is that our electric system was built to encourage energy consumption. So you would think that the existing system should be great for society today, since almost everything we do requires electricity. But electricity is more than just having light when it gets dark. From using our cell phones and computers to pumps that keep our water and wastewater systems running, traffic lights that keep our streets safe, and now transportation through electric vehicles. Electricity is essentially the engine that runs our society. But climate change is taxing that engine beyond its original capabilities. And the consequences are less reliability, more inequity, more pollution, more carbon in the atmosphere, which increases climate change.
Those are all good points. While the grid was built for energy consumption, it was built at a time when our major energy needs were lighting and day-to-day appliance operation. In just the last decade or so, we've seen a massive surge in home and office energy needs with all of the smartphones, our computers, and more recently, electric vehicles. The reality of the electric grid that we're working with needs to be dealt with in order to move away from fossil fuels. And storage and ability to transport long distances are two of the major limiting factors with renewable energy. The way energy is made today, as soon as it's produced, it's used. So with coal, that's a steady production and that works, whereas the rate of wind blowing is more variable, and we need things like battery storage in order to hold that energy for when we actually need it. Battery storage on a small scale is being worked on, but it's still quite costly and not quite to the point of being available on a large scale. Can you talk a little bit about these limitations and what's being done about it?
In 2022, we are still struggling to figure out exactly how to incorporate peak power into renewable energy systems. How do we get 24/7 power if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing? Engineers and entrepreneurs are thinking about how we can connect local power to or microgrids to the existing system, and it's more complicated than just plugging something in. There has been a lot of progress in the last 5 years to a decade on the technology side to solving these problems, but the policies needed to implement them are not there yet. This leads us back to what we were just discussing, the need to engage our communities, businesses, and politicians in this discussion of how to strengthen our grid.
That's a good point, because as planners, we haven't been part of this conversation until recently. We've been scrambling to adopt new solar and wind regulations in our communities while balancing the needs of our community members. We're faced with the challenge of trying to sift through the research that's out there on the impacts and whether they may or may not have any negative impacts, and trying to understand new technologies such as microgrids. What should planners be thinking about in our day-to-day work as development review planners, or as we're developing our long-range plans in regards to the grid?
Yeah, microgrids are a good place to start. I would say big picture, we need to think about climate change. We saw last winter in Texas and last summer in California with rolling blackouts what happens to the grid when unpredictable weather occurs. It's no secret that we're seeing more and more unpredictable weather and need to plan for resiliency for both long-term and short-term. Even if climate or weather wasn't an issue, there's still the issue of plants and animals and the damage they can do on the grid. As planners, we advocate for greener communities. We want to see trees lining the streets and shading parking lots. But trees in the wrong places can be a real problem for our electric grid. Incorporating nature into infrastructure has always been a challenge. We need trees in our communities, but we also need power. And when they're sharing the same rights of way or easements, it can be a real problem.
It is a follow-up to that. How can we overcome these obstacles? Many people think, well, to solve the squirrel problem, we'll just bury the lines, but that's not always the easiest answer.
Multi-solving or co-benefit solutions. That's what planners are best at. We shouldn't telescope on a single issue, but look at the chain reaction a web of interactions has on the implementation of a particular solution. We need planners not just in urban planning offices, but working for utilities, landscape companies, telecommunications, agricultural businesses, economic development, all sectors, so that we can head off conflicts before they happen. We can't predict all possible problems, but we can sure try.
As planners, we often find ourselves at the center of controversial land use decisions. The best way to make these processes go more smoothly is to lay the groundwork for decision-making ahead of time in our comprehensive plans and our zoning ordinances. If we identify the criteria for siting large-scale solar arrays or place an emphasis on converting to renewable energy as a community, it's going to be less of a surprise when these types of applications are submitted or an electric utility needs to expand a major transmission line. Can you talk about what conversations we should be having now to set us up for a better energy grid future?
Comprehensive planning as well as zoning that enables new technologies to be successful, yet vetted by both local and regional community discussions. If you're not already talking about wind and solar systems, residential, commercial, utility scale, and microgrids, smart grids, batteries, small-scale nuclear, geothermal, incentives such as TIF focused on zero carbon developments, energy efficiency in city infrastructure, and transmission lines, all of these directly relate back to the energy grid. We need to educate ourselves on these technologies so that we can better understand how they, for better or worse, will impact how we live, work, and play in our communities.
It's well documented that in the past, communities have placed energy plants powered by coal and other fuels that have significant health impacts in neighborhoods with higher rates of minority and low-income residents. With clean energy like wind and solar, it would seem that their locations are less limiting because they haven't been shown to negatively impact health, but locating them properly is still important. What are some of the challenges that we face when trying to site new components of the electric grid?
That's a great question, Stephanie. The book describes a situation of transmission lines well, why they are so difficult to get built. Gretchen's book says, first, we don't want to pay more money for our electricity, even though we enjoy some of the cheapest power in the world. Second, lines have gone out of vogue. No one wants them near their house. No one even wants them in their wilderness areas. No one wants to see them running along hilltops or through canyon lands. No one wants to see their back 40 for the passage of these great chords of modern life. Not in my backyard has come to the bulk power industry. And as much as we might desire reliability, electricity delivered to our homes, we don't want to pay more for it, and we fight tooth and nail, as battle after battle has shown, to keep any new transmission from becoming a visible blight upon our land.
Over the last few years, with the leadership of the American Planning Association, we as a profession have placed a focus on equity in our plans and our processes. How can we ensure that there is an equity lens when we talk about our electric grids and reshaping them to handle the needs of our changing environment?
Although this book focuses on electricity and how the grid came to be, what is clear is that the grid of the future needs local participation through education and outreach. It is clear that our current grid did not consider equity when it was being created. Its only focus was on keeping the lights on 24/7. This led to pollution and greater health complications due to that pollution in underrepresented communities. When we both educate and provide a platform for conversation, it is easier to identify where inequalities arise and how it can be counterbalanced. This inevitably will create a more robust and efficient grid of the future. The Initiative for Energy Justice put out the Energy Justice Workbook, which is a really great resource for this topic.
The Great Plains Institute up in Minnesota has put out a lot of really great resources in regards to renewable energy and ways to create kind of co-beneficial spaces. An example of this is planting native plants under solar arrays to attract bees and butterflies, which provides a good habitat for important pollinators. What do you think is the most important thing that our listeners today should take away from this episode?
I think the most important thing for planners to take away is that education is necessary at a local level and at a national level in order to have an impact on our energy grid. It's necessary for us to get to a zero carbon future. And if planners start talking about energy in their staff reports, in their comprehensive plans, in their public meetings, then it's going to become part of the nomenclature. People are going to be thinking about energy with new developments. They're going to be thinking about energy when they buy houses. Is it energy efficient? These are the sorts of things that planners do best. They educate, they listen, and they give voice to new technologies that are going to make our future better.
All right, and the last question for this episode, why would you recommend our listeners read this book?
If you don't know much about electricity other than the lights in your computer come on when you flip a switch, this book will give you the background and the context to understand the poles and the wires that we all see every day. Gretchen Bakke is a very good storyteller. She makes what could be a boring topic enjoyable. This book also examines the past policies implemented and the policies needed to build a better system. I hope that if you read or listen to the book, you find points in the policy discussion that you don't agree with. This will stimulate conversation and get more people thinking about how we regulate and incentivize power.
This has been a great conversation today on a topic that is so important but often not given the attention that it deserves in our day-to-day planning environment. Thank you for joining me on this episode, Christy.
Thanks for talking about the grid with me today, Stephanie. I really enjoyed the book, and I sure hope that the listeners read it and enjoy it as much as I did. But even if they don't read it, the most important thing I hope they take away from our conversation today is that power is fundamental to our society. and yet most people know very little about it. As planners, we need to educate ourselves, our planning students, our communities about how the grid works. Once we better understand the dynamic of what it takes to turn on the lights, can we really begin to build healthier, more resilient communities? Don't wait to educate. And speaking of education, I wanted to put out there that APA has partnered with ICMA for a 9-part webinar series on how local government actions affect large-scale solar development outcomes. It should be really interesting, and I hope folks tune in for that.